17.
It's August 17. Ukraine Media Center confirms starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko. Within the main communication platform of Ukraine Brain Hub, we start our panel discussion. Topic: fighting corruption during wartime. We'll talk about the results of the sociological study about condition of corruption in Ukraine and coverage of corruption in media. We'll talk about the attitudes of the citizens to corruption and coverage of this topic in media and the priorities for the country. So before we proceed to our conversation and before we start, I would like to give the floor to Atsika Silashvili.
Because I know that the translation is provided, and I will be very brief in my introduction because we have ahead of us very interesting discussion, I'm sure of that. But few words that I wanted to say from my side. It is very important for us to take time and reflect, as we will do today, but beyond as well, on how public that has suffered so much and is suffering still, takes the issue of integrity and fight against corruption in this very critical time for this country. And the results of this number of researches that have been done by our partner organizations, by ourselves, and then content that will be discussed today, showcases this remarkable phenomenon, I would say, as somebody that knows Ukraine very well. Even for me, it was something that I took with great appreciation, that internal motivation and dedication and understanding why values, principles, values related to democracy in this country, freedom and resilience for the country in terms of security as well, depends how all of the reforms that Ukraine embarked on since the revolution of dignity matter now as well, even more than ever in this case. And it's not something that is artificial. It's not something that is sacrificed to the greater, as one could have named it, goals of security and freedom in the future. They are inherent to those concepts. And I think in this way, for us, it is very important to listen carefully to where the mindset, expectation, demand of the people are, so that when it comes to the actions, activities that we are engaged in, planning, public institutions, donors, technical assistance projects, civil society representatives that are so famous and so active in this country, are well aware of where the public mindset is, and then engages public in these very difficult times, but beyond, after the victory as well, in reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine in the way that ensures participation, ownership, and with that, next leap forward to the development of Ukraine, which will be prosperous, free, secure, part of European family, as we all know that it will be the future of this country, and secure as the member of NATO as well in the future. So in this regard, we pay tribute with this event to Ukrainian people, to their aspirations, their expectations, and then we want to showcase that we don't only owe it to them, but we take practical reflections and then takeaways and lessons from what they want to say to us, what they expect and demand in terms of the delivery. And in that regard, I will finish with that. And I mentioned it maybe a couple of times in other events, but I firmly believe in it, that it's clear already now that apart everything else as well, or in addition, I would say, what we see is that reform agenda, modernization agenda, and democratic idea of prosperous Ukraine did not fall victim of this brutal war. And that's the tribute and appreciation to all of Ukrainians and people of Ukraine. So I'll stop with that, not to take too much time, and I wish you a very fruitful, good discussion, and I'll be myself following here from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Отже, я представлю учасників нашої дискусії.
Okay, so I will switch to introduction of our guests. It's either Khalilov, USAID Engage, Roman Vybranovsky, USAID SACCI, Andrii Boranov, Transparency International Ukraine, Darina Kaleniuk, Anti-Corruption Action Center, and Yuri Nikolov, Nashi Groshi Editorial. So let's start with the discussion of the results of the sociological study about the condition of corruption in Ukraine. Mr. Aider, can you please tell us what were the results of this study? Good morning, everybody. If I may start the presentation, I won't take a lot of your time, maybe 10 minutes or so. In principle, starting from the year 2007, this study is going on. Every 2 years we study the condition of corruption in Ukraine. Perception, experience, and attitude of the population is the biggest sociological research in Ukraine. By its scale, we usually question about 10,000 people, the general drawdown. And additionally, this year we've questioned the internally displaced persons and those who became refugees abroad to understand how they perceive corruption, what is their attitude, what is their experience in this regard. The only thing I want to say is that for us this question was done by CMIS, so there is trust to all the study data. They were obtained by proper sociological way. The only remark here is that in fact we were gathering all those data in winter, we were processing them. They are not, for today, they are not so fresh. They are a couple of months old, just for everyone's understanding, so that the latest events unfolding in Ukraine recently with regard to countering corruption, they may not be covered by that data. First is the attitude and experience of corruption that the citizens have. And according to this data, we see that corruption is the problem number 2 in Ukraine after the war. It goes right after the war. The only thing we observe is that the internally displaced individuals, they put corruption on the 3rd place because for them survival is more important and social and economic issues are more important to them. They take 2 first places, but generally the society perceives corruption as a very important problem for Ukraine. As to the level of corruption after the 24th of February last year, you see we've taken 3 drawdowns: internally displaced persons, refugees, and the populations, and the opinions split. Some people say they don't know. It's difficult for them to answer this question. I think that it's more related to the security. People not always say to what extent the corruption has either grown or not grown. However, the majority thinks that it has either grown or remained the same. Whether the corruption is widespread in Ukraine or not, you see we've compared the data as of the years 2018, years 2021, and years 2023, and you see regardless of the fall of this level, the population thinks that the corruption rate is going down. Still, it's very widespread. 43% think so. The level of non-tolerance to corruption, you see it's grown year to year, and 42% was in year 2021 and year 2018, and now 53% think that corruption is not tolerated within the society. The least tolerant to corruption are internally displaced people in Ukraine, and the most tolerant are those who are staying abroad. So we've took a general overview of this study. The Ukrainians who end up abroad are the most pessimistic with regard to what's going on with corruption inside Ukraine, how those processes of establishment of anti-corruption institutions are going on. You will see some more slides that represent this picture for us. Then, regarding the experience of corruption with the citizens, lately we see that, and we see that less citizens are now facing corruption, and this trend started in 2021. And for example, in year 2018, it was 50% of people who were facing corruption in their lives. Now, this figure fell down to 14%. In year 21, this figure was 16%. So it was all about practice, not what people think, not what's people's opinion, but really to what extent are they facing the corruption in their lives. You see, the majority, 81%, are not facing corruption. Regarding reporting about corruption, 57% of people think that reporting corruption does not result in anything. There were more answers, but the key answer is that it will just result in nothing. The people do not believe that such actions will just be resulting in anything. Trust to the government agencies, quite an interesting data in my opinion. They are dictated by the fact of war in Ukraine, and comparing to the years 1821 and today, we see that there is the phenomenal growth of trust to government institutions. You see, all government institutions, including anti-corruption agencies. The most trust is enjoyed by the National Police and Security Service of Ukraine, comparing with the specialized anti-corruption agencies, for example. But at the same time, we see that the citizens think that those most responsible for fighting corruption are Security Service of Ukraine and National Police. But if we see who wants to fight corruption, on the first place is the office of the president. 53% of the population think that the office of the president wants to fight corruption most of all, but still only 44% bears this responsibility in the office of the president. And you see other anti-corruption agencies, the trust to them, and to what extent those bodies or those agencies want to fight corruption, well, the figures are more or less the same. At the same time, the population thinks that they are the main drivers of eradication of corruption. So the citizens think that we want to eradicate corruption mostly, and whether they are responsible for that, we see there is a growth that 13% of the population think that yes, we are responsible, and 70% of the population assert that they want it. As to the civil organizations, the percentage is different, so only 2% vest this responsibility in civil organizations, but still only 49% think that the civil organizations want to fight corruption, and obviously local governments, a lot of responsibility is vested into them. Internally displaced Ukrainians and those who are abroad, they vest most of the responsibility in anti-corruption agencies, just like the major part of the population. But those staying abroad, they think that the establishment of anti-corruption agencies should solve the problem with corruption. However, we see that even the regular citizens are responsible for that too. According to a study, the Ukrainians think that the government has become less corrupt. You see the percentage in front of every institution. We see that the least corrupt is the office of the president. This is how it's considered. You see, only 14% of the population this year think that the office of the president is a corrupt agency. You see, parliament, local governments, they have become less corrupt. It's not a fact, but is the perception of the population. Regarding the areas mostly corrupt in Ukraine, there were no changes. The first place is customs, then judicial system, prosecutor's office, then medicine, and land. Those are the main 5 spheres that remain mostly corrupt. Then communication of the anti-corruption efforts. So as to the scale of corruption, those 5 sectors are still the same. So according to the opinion of the people, those are the 5 most corrupt areas. So talking about communication of the anti-corruption efforts, the majority of the people, regardless of the fact that they know little about how the communication of the special anti-corruption agencies is going on, they trust and they think that the government agencies efficiently cope with corruption. And it's quite an interesting fact. We know little, but we trust and we assert they do everything efficiently. We related to the fact that now there is a condition in the country that no matter what the government agencies do, it's considered to be correct, and that countering corruption is going on in a proper way. Security Service of Ukraine is considered to be the leader in fighting corruption. We see the percentage, it's really so. Anti-corruption agencies, civil organizations, they are in fact very little is known about their campaigns, but people still think that their way of countering corruption is very efficient. Talking about optimism, we see that the majority of the citizens, 50%, they think or they treat it optimistically, and they think that the government agencies efficiently fight corruption. And about the way the citizens influence the fighting against corruption, how the citizens take part in it. The citizens feel that they can influence what's going on with countering corruption, and at the same time we see that the role of civil organization and civil control is being decreased. From the point of view of the citizens, they think that this option of fighting corruption as a civil control, it's less efficient than the direct countering corruption by the specialized agencies that are supposed to fight corruption on a daily basis. At the same time, the citizens are ready to defend their rights. If we see, starting from the year 2007, 52% currently are ready to stand for their rights when there is a violation of such rights by the bureaucrats. Well, internally displaced persons are less ready to stand for their rights in their fight with the government officials than countering corrupt officials. Here we're not talking about the real cases, but whether the people are ready, whether they can, but the reality may be different. Ready to get involved in fighting corruption, but preferring passive methods like signing petition, writing or reporting to the mass media, to the social media, but to submit the official report is a difficult instrument for the people, and people think that it may have some negative consequences. The motivation why people are ready to fight corruption is mostly in patriotic sentiment of the population. They think that it would help their state, it would help to preserve Ukraine. Those are the patriotic sentiments, or some personal ruminations. Main obstacle is a physical threat. So the people think that if they submit official reports against the corrupt officials, it can pose a physical threat for them. This is why they don't do so. Well, the methodology, I have already mentioned it, and the overall conclusion of ours is that the citizens for the time being really have this trust to the civil organizations, to the government agencies. They expressed a lot about it, providing some credit of trust, and the trust of civil organizations and government agencies, specifically anti-corruption agencies, is to transform this trust, and the reserve of those forces to be transformed into effort to fight corruption. And those people staying abroad, no matter that they are numerous and they would influence the way Ukraine is developing, we still need to think to what extent and how can we engage those people who are currently staying abroad in transformations which are going on in Ukraine. And the patriotic sentiment is dictating the way the anti-corruption mainstream is developing in Ukraine. That's all on my end. Thank you, Mr. Aider. We see that people trust the government agencies in fighting corruption, but they are poorly informed about how it's going on. I would like to expand on this. Let's see what's going on with the media. So, Mr. Roman, what are the results of the content analysis regarding the coverage of corruption in the media? I'll try to make it the shortest possible. I'll tell you what are the data that I'm about to present today. So we're talking in fact about the annual analysis, the content analysis of coverage of corruption in the media that was ordered by USAID and fulfilled by the company, the Center for Content Analysis. So we cannot make a full content analysis, but we can talk about tendencies. The media is containing so much materials that we can talk only about specific tendencies. We have to understand those tendencies, and the majority of the people approves their decision regarding what's going on in Ukraine from the media, not from the personal experience, but from the media. A couple of things that are important for our discussion: to what extent and how media can react. First, the main thing, we've almost reached the level of the year 2021 in coverage of corruption. It's the second topic on the media. Again, I'll tell you about the attempts to reduce the coverage in the media and why it failed. It failed thanks to the social media, but it's no good news because social networks contain not only positive news but a lot of things that we may not like as well. So in fact we didn't reach the level of year 2019 because there the corruption was covered all the time, even within the presidential campaign. And in February this year, we reached the level of year 21, thanks to different studies, including the study by Mr. Yuri Nikolov. So what's basically the difference? We may see that the joint marathon was trying to talk about corruption as something that was already overcome, and they were trying to say that Ukraine works a lot on overcoming corruption and everything is alright, but the social networks did not believe it, and the Marathon United had to start finding excuses. So the demand of the citizens was achieved. They could have not do it, and they basically failed. We see it in the statistics, in the general statistics. At certain phase in both marathon and the mass media, the corruption topic took second place, but there is again the difference. The mass media talk more about specific cases of corruption and that corruption is being overcome, like we've found somebody, we've tried to sentence somebody. So in the mass media there are more critics and more overall reflections, general reflections. There is a lot of negative information in the mass media apart from comments of the people, and it's also provoked by politics and presence of pro-Russian activists there. So corruption is the problem that should be cured, but if it's not cured directly in social networks, is being added by Russians critics and political critics that we have nothing to do, we can do nothing about. The topics again in the mass media and social networks was different. Like, for example, fighting corruption is fundamental and instrumental for joining EU. In social media, that's different. Like the government is using the war for enrichment and stuff like that. So again, in the mass media, there were a lot of discussions about Ministry of Infrastructure. For example, the Ministry of Infrastructure said like that there is a person, there is the reaction of the government. Yes, there are certain suspicions of corruption with regard to this person. So on the social media, it was Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Sport, and Ministry of Finance, because in social media people don't really treat the necessity to refer to some official point of view. The social networks give you opportunity to criticize way more. Anti-corruption institutions, in fact, were under fire of the critics in the social media, most of all National Anti-Corruption Agencies, Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and State Investigation Bureau. And this connection is very important here. A lot of attention was paid in the mass media to the civil society. We were saying the civil society is getting involved in the problems. So in the social media, it was said that civil society are those who solve the problems with the corruption. And so here we have Daria Khalilov and Mr. Nikolov to corroborate it. Also, the difference between mass media and social media is that the mass media is more aimed at the news, and social media is more about reflections, analytics and stuff like that. Why we have prepared this data, and we will hand them over to all the law enforcement agencies, to civil organizations and media, to make sure that during the following campaigns that use the data from sociology and media monitoring, so that they are more focused on responding to the demand of people regarding the fight with corruption, so that civil organizations and government institutions pay more attention to this. I will end with the positive story. We keep track of how digitalization is being discussed as an anti-corruption instrument, and it's really one of the ways to drive the anti-corruption discussion from negative, from discussions of say executions, which is one of the demands of the people, and to transform it into explanation why there are preventive things and they matter, something that may decrease the corruption as a phenomena. And if in year 2019 only 1% of corruption reports was about digitalization and new services, now it's 10% of such reports. And people understand that the less opportunities there are in corruption, and we see it in the social media, the better the people understand that there is a response to their demand and the discussion. I would like to talk about how to make sure that people's demand is responded, because if it's not responded by the civil organizations, by media and government institutions, they will be offered such solutions from the people we really don't like, those we're currently in war with. And another interesting thing is that there is no one single person responsible for fighting corruption from the point of view of efficiency. So shouldn't there be so much anti-corruption institutions, there would be no civil activists, there would be no independent mass media, and we would have no results. So our monitoring shows that only joint effort helps us go out of this situation when everybody was saying that it's untimely, and we realized that it is very timely. So let's start our discussion with the place of government institutions in fighting corruption and how the government institutions should respond or react to this demand by the society. Ms. Polina, what's your opinion? How can we preserve this phenomenal level of trust expressed by the society to anti-corruption institutions? How to increase this trust? How to make this work even more efficient? Good morning. Thank you for invitation. Thank you for those interesting studies. I would like to start that we're all sister organizations, everybody who's represented in this panel, everybody in their area, but we have one common goal: to overcome corruption. I think that no one is idealistic thinking that it would be fought with some magic stick, but we all work to make sure that the level of corruption decreases in Ukraine, and thus the trust to us is growing because the society sees. And obviously when we're saying about National Anti-Corruption Agency, just like the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office and Special Anti-Corruption Court, that was a demand after the revolution of dignity to start fighting corruption for real. So what I want to emphasize, how the government agencies communicated, and this balance between the demand of the society for information and communication to the law enforcement agency, which National Anti-Corruption Agency is. So it's a slippery road, you know. Even studying the experience of other countries, their anti-corruption agencies were trying to find that balance of how it should be going on in Ukraine, because on one hand, when you post a lot in the social media, in the websites, when you report a lot about your activities, the society has this impression like they have nothing to do other than publishing news on the social media. But when you don't publish the news in the social media and websites, the society has an impression that they don't work because they don't write about anything. So it's a very fragile balance, how to communicate it in a way to ensure our efficiency and at the same time to preserve the secrecy of investigation, and to know how not to make a fest out of a search. It's a normal work for those detectives, and for them it's a very difficult question how to show to the society that we work efficiently, and how to demonstrate that we don't only publish news on the social media. That's the first accent I would like to put. And talking about the Russian narratives, we're not saying that there is no corruption in Ukraine and it's all made up by Russia and it's Russian narratives. Obviously, just like everybody, I follow the social networks, I follow the investigations of the journalists, and it's important to have this information hygiene here to understand what's the difference between revealing some corruption, the facts of corruption, and to understand what's the difference between it and the Russian narratives. We understand that our enemy will never be happy with our success. So this information hygiene, which is another complicated issue, how to make sure it's not only like something that we talk about, but we do as well. Because for me, for example, as I read some piece of news, I try to analyze it, whether it's true or not, how it was written, by whom, is it a political game, or it's really some fact of corruption that has taken place. And regarding the joint work against Russian narratives and development of public campaigns, we've agreed on the cooperation with the Stratcom and the Ministry of Culture regarding the joint campaigns, joint actions to show that yes, corruption exists, but such institutions as National Anti-Corruption Agency, Special and Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, where they are here to fight corruption. Regarding the 57% of the population of respondents who do not report about corruption, who think that it wouldn't be efficient, I'm really upset by this figure, because the principle start with yourself. It should be working. If you see that the corruption exists, that it's there, like Mr. Nikolov, for example, he exposes the facts of corruption that later on become, to bigger or lesser extent, reasons for pre-trial investigation by law enforcement agencies. But if you experience corruption but you keep silent about it, I think that we're going nowhere, specifically given the conditions that we're fighting the external aggression. I'm talking as a representative of National Anti-Corruption Agency. I'm talking about corruption in the government. And for example, I personally decided not to go to the government-controlled hospitals because I decided that it's easier to just pay in a private hospital once rather than do not know what to do after the consultation in a government-controlled hospital. So another thing I want to say, to what extent are our efforts joined, I mean all the anti-corruption agencies, what is the perception of us in the media, in the society? The expectations were such that anti-corruption agencies arrive, they fight corruption, and that's pretty much it. I like the comparison between National Anti-Corruption Agency and the surgeon, and we say that the state is like a human being, and if we don't maintain a healthy way of life, like visiting doctors, doing some checkups within certain intervals. So we're talking about the state and some systemic changes in the state, and the anti-corruption agency is a surgeon that cuts some cancer tumors from the body. So the expectations of the society is an important topic for us, something that we work on. We have to explain who anti-corruption agencies are, what we do, so that people come to us reporting the facts, the problems that may fall under our responsibility. And to me, as a citizen and as a representative on the anti-corruption agency, I think that everything is investigated by the detectives of our agency quite effectively. So let's proceed to Mr. Andrii. In your opinion, how to make sure that the civil society, which is deeply concerned now, how to have them better engaged, because they are not ready to act in this process, how to make the civil society more active, specifically those citizens whom we see are more skeptical regarding the fighting corruption in Ukraine, I mean those staying abroad. Well, thank you for your question. I'll start from the end. I'm not really surprised by this difference between those who are abroad and those who are in Ukraine. Maybe those live the country who say, oh, damn it, this country, it's very bad in there, we're leaving. So obviously they're less ready to fight corruption, and those who are more ready, they stay here. So if they don't want to fight it and they stay abroad, it would be interesting to see this connection with those respondents. How many of them plan to come back to Ukraine? I think that they will be in very small numbers. Unfortunately, we know from other studies that quarter of those Ukrainians staying abroad, they want to stay there further on. Another half is still reflecting, and another quarter say they're coming back for sure. So it would be difficult probably to reach out to them because they live in another information field. They solve their current tasks, they take care of themselves, and I understand the internally displaced persons very well. Those who stay in Ukraine, they are internally displaced individuals, and they experience a lot of interaction with the state. You know, in Ukraine, people don't really like to interact with the state. Well, our government agencies work differently, like comparing to what they used to do like 10 years ago. But how to get people engaged, we have to demonstrate the people, because we have to where this result of fighting corruption will be best for them. There is a big problem with the corruption in the courts, but on the other hand, let's say, like, what is the percentage of Ukrainians experiencing any interaction with the courts? So talking about internally displaced persons, probably we have to of more media activity on the problems that people are facing in interaction with the government. So like in order to get those compensations of the status of internally displaced individuals. But talking about compensation, everything is more digitalized. But my main message is that to make sure that people get involved, that they should be demonstrated some result that they can get for themselves. So this is probably where we should focus our efforts. Do we have enough civil organizations working with those problems? We can name maybe 2-3 main ones, but generally, can they cover most of those problems? Probably not, but we should continue trying to do so. But it's the issue of national policy on the regional and national level. It covers a lot of people. I also wanted to give a couple of comments regarding digitalization, because I don't really like a lot this message that digitalization is a super tool for fighting corruption. Yes, this message was promoted for a long time, maybe starting from the year 2019, but again, I can give you another example where it's not panacea. Basically, all the decisions are taken by the people. We're talking about the procurement. For example, it was a successful reform because there was some newspaper which was received by a small number of people, and Yuri may tell you a lot about that. And now everything is digitalized. You're sitting in your pajamas at home, drinking coffee, and you're looking for corruption. It's cool. Well, obviously, the opportunities for corruption have decreased because people who want to be named bad word by Yuri Nikolov, this segment of people significantly decreased. But again, any system can be hacked. You know, in this sphere of procurement, the control was vested into journalists and civil organizations, but the government control, not when anti-corruption agency comes fighting results of the corruption, but there was not enough will to make sure that the government controls those procurements, because the system is a software. Everything should be controlled by the people, maybe with the support of digitalized tools, but anyway, we haven't come there. We shouldn't say that digitalization solves all the problems. You know, there is a trend in the world of studying corruption in digitalization, because digitalizing some bad process does not solve a problem as it is. So digitalization itself is cool, but saying that it solves our problems with corruption, I cannot agree. I cannot agree with those thousands of people that you were questioning. It's a good tool, yes, but it's not comprehensive. Let's continue talking about civil organizations. Ms. Daria, the society really relies a lot upon civil organizations on par with the government. Like, I will not write that report myself, but I know there are people who can do it for me. They will control, they will write that report for me, and again, there is a significant level of trust. But Mr. Andrii has asked the question that I will readdress to you. Are there enough organizations that are fighting corruption? Are they efficient enough, and how to increase their efficiency and to preserve the trust of the society? Further on, thank you for a question. Before answering it, I will add another number. We were also making a sociological survey, and as of May, there was a question: what will be the security threats most important to you within the month to come? And the citizens of Ukraine think that massive strikes on the Ukrainian cities by the Russians is the most actual threat. Meanwhile, 33% of the people say that corruption is a serious threat, serious security threat right now. To put it in perspective, about 25% of the population think that another offensive by the Russians may pose a security threat, and a little bit less think that nuclear strike by the Russians may pose a security threat. So 33% of the population equalize corruption to security risk. It means that the tolerance to corruption decreases, and is decreasing because Ukrainians, the mission of Ukrainians now is to achieve security, and according to the new data, there was a study by Democratic Initiatives Fund. They tied the efficiency to fighting corruption with the efficiency of the state in countering aggression. It's good and bad at the same time. You know, since it's an existential threat, the citizens are ready to act, and this study shows that the citizens are ready to protect their interests. But on the flip side, not all of the government agencies, including those who are supposed to efficiently spend government resources for defense and security, that everything there is fulfilled with honesty and honor. And the civil organizations, I think Mr. Yuri will tell us more about this, more than a year ago, they had a serious dilemma. Should we stop the self-censure? Should we stop the civil organizations or investigation journalists in their accusations against the government? Was there corruption 1 year ago? Yes, right, but the focus has shifted to mobilization and repelling the enemy. But if within the first days, within the first month after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we could close our eyes to some, so to say, inefficiency by the government agencies in, say, in procurement of different goods and services necessary for the defense, or ensure the construction of the defense structures for our critical infrastructure facilities. So after the year after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, our government cannot say that, you know, we didn't know it, it's war going on, we have to rush around looking for ammunition and procure them at high prices, and to procure the construction materials at increased prices too. So, you know, the civil organizations, the journalists gave the government like half a year, and then we realized that our non-public communication with the government about their inefficiency, they don't work. We're not heard. What happened is some self-glorification of the heads of some government agencies. They've lost the sense of reality, and to bring them back to this reality, we have started talking openly what are the problems inside the government agencies. I remember in the center of country corruption, we started talking about it softly, like deep enough that we should fix the procurement, for example, in the defense sector. And then that was the culmination. Yuri's article and the rest of the civil organizations and journalists started, well, you know, they got themselves relieved of this self-censure, and they started criticizing the government openly and directly. We were weighing it whether we should go public or not, but I want to explain why we were weighing it. We also advocacy Ukrainian interests in the international level, and we understand that the more Ukraine looks corrupt, the more corruption scandals we have, the more they will be used by Russian propaganda to discredit Ukraine. But not exposing corruption is not an option either. So after some reflections, we decided that we better mobilize, and we expect our partners that, look, even during the full-scale invasion, when there are missiles flying over our heads, the civil society continues acting in Ukraine, just like the investigative journalists who expose corruption in the defense sector. Show us another country in the world that does so. This is the working argument. And we say, you know, no one hears about any corruption in Belarus. No one hears any corruption scandals. There are no detention or arrests of the Supreme Court head. But do we really believe that there is no corruption in Belarus, or like, I don't know, Uzbekistan, for example? So shifting the focus of communication in the international level, we have decided that, all right, we'll proceed to criticizing, and it started working. Criticizing by the society, not only civil organizations, not only by journalists, but by volunteers, volunteer foundations. It kind of motivates the government even more than the requirements of the international partners. For example, now there is a very vivid discussion around returning the obligation by the government officials to submit tax declarations. The international partners, they take it quite softly, specifically the necessity to return the declarations into the public field. You know that they say it's a war going on. We cannot disclose all the information regarding where we live, where our relatives live, but the society, 95% of the population, think that it's necessary to reopen public declarations, even to return it during the war. And this demand is very powerful. It influences how the politicians act. The draft law was accepted during the first reading about the resumption of declarations. There are some gaps how the riches can be concealed. You may not declare the third persons from whom you get credits, for example. So I hope that the government will cover those gaps, and they will resume declarations as they were before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, with exception to the military. But
it's only happening after the pressure by the society, and the more exposing there is of corruption in the enlistment offices and the procurement agencies with the Ministry of Defense, the more is the demand by the society, like, don't cover yourself with secrecy, just open all the data. And in this balance between the secrecy and the instrument of civil control, the Ukrainian society chooses the instrument of civil control. But again, how the citizens can counter corruption? Just expose it, but the number of instruments has decreased. Without access to declarations, it's very difficult to control where the head of the local government or local prosecutor, for example, what riches they have accumulated during the war. So now, as a civil organizations, we're working on satisfying the demand of the population, with some exception of some cases like the military, and I think that it will return those instruments for the citizens, using which they can expose corruption, because exposing corruption is an important tool for the citizens for countering them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Polina has something to respond. Well, before we proceed to Mr. Yuri, as I understand, I would like to say that Darina and CPK and Mr. Yuri are the representatives of the healthy civil society that can be treated in different ways. You may like them or not, but what they do is a colossal job that helps our state in fight. For example, Darina says that they communicate with the international partners, but again, it helps us inside here in Ukraine. I may have formulated myself a little bit maybe unclear, but if you see any effects of corruption at any level, no matter whether it's a top level government official or it's some corruption on the, I don't know, everyday level, please report it, because law enforcement agencies are supposed to fight it, no matter how utopic it sounds, but to make our country better, specifically when we win, when the war is over. We are supposed to live in a different environment that does not tolerate corruption and fights it efficiently. Mr. Yuri, there was no panelist today who wouldn't have mentioned you. Well, yeah, I've even got scared. Well, appealing to this message that the society is not so well informed about the condition of fighting corruption in Ukraine, what media can do to reinforce this communication, and what can be the positive aspect of communication? We've seen it in the study that mostly corruption is discussed in a negative aspect. Well, it's normal. Media informs about the searches and stuff, so when anti-corruption agencies will make more arrests, when the courts will award more sentences, I will be the first one to say that this scam was sentenced, for example, but now we have what we have in this presentation, you know. I was rejoiced by this case that Lazinski was detained, their deputy. But yes, really, it's been a year, and in this case, those who were detained are currently cooperating with the investigation bodies, and now the story starts working when a criminal gets released from prison due to some reasons, but again, he is released without mentioning any organizers. So I will never believe that the deputy minister organized a scheme worth 1 billion. I will never believe that the head of the Supreme Court organized a criminal organization so that the judges take relevant decisions, and none of those judges is even interrogated. So it's all in the hands of the law enforcement agencies. They can create history, they make history, we cover it. If there is no history, what should we do? What should we write about? Convinced. You see, in this study it says that Ukrainians are passive, and it's right. I like this instrument, like, share, comment, because this is exactly what puts political focus. Our government is very sensitive to the sentiment, to the ratings, and I'm convinced it's my position that the fish starts rotting from its head, and it should start recuperating from its head. If you want to make the law enforcement agencies more active, it's not the responsibility of the voters. The voters cannot influence the law enforcement agencies. It's up to top level government officials. It's not about all the corruptioners have lived, but it's about getting them, catching them on the border. Well, I'm appealing to law enforcement agencies here. So again, the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has a full set of tools to influence the level of corruption in Ukraine, and I'm far from thinking, far from advising him on some stuff reconfigurations. I'm a media person. I'm providing him with information to take proper decisions, and the decisions they're taken, well, we will evaluate it 15 minutes after the victory. Thank you. So the question we all gathered here to answer to in this triad: media, civil society, and the government. How should they interact to make sure that fighting corruption is at the new level, so that it does not wane after the victory, you know, when the expectations fall a little bit. So if anybody has any thoughts in this regard, please, the floor is yours. Well, if I may, two things. First, to react to the comment of my colleague regarding digitalization. Obviously, there is no magic stick, and digitalization may result in something negative. We were working with some city, it was very digitalized, and it got all the prizes for being digitalized, and then it turned out that the citizens, the denizens of that city, have no idea about what digitalization is, and the mayor, in the opinion of the denizens, the mayor was doing it to get some prizes from Kiev. So again, when we were trying to find out how the people, what people were expecting from the portal of those who expose corruption, for example, why Yuri Nikolov is not the one who exposes corruption, but the digitalization itself is not a story itself, but as to the interaction, we have to, like, you know, one of the Ukrainian governments, they had the concept of one voice. It never have worked, because everybody who was coming to that hall, they were saying that the one voice is their voice. So step one is to recognize that the journalists are going to beat you no matter what. The government institutions will protect themselves and criticize corruption when it will be necessary and useful for them, and the civil activists will do what they do. They will just continue what they're doing. So recognition of everyone's mandate is the only indicator that if we recognize it, we will start normally understanding it. So our analysis has showed that when everybody grabs their hands and start working all together, it works for like 1.5 months, not longer than that. Thank you. Do we have anything to add? Maybe someone from the floor has any questions, journalists, or maybe anybody wants to join our discussion. well, then probably after the end of this event, someone will want to discuss it off records. If guests want to summarize it, how to continue this joint work, and if not, so I propose to wrap up our discussion. I'm reminding you we were talking about countering corruption during the war. I think all the ideas that were pronounced today will help us build more efficient system of countering corruption in Ukraine. Ukrainian Media Center Ukrinform will continue its operation tomorrow. Please stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us. Glory to Ukraine.